We have the summary of week 3 of the Derek Chauvin trial, which is essentially the conclusion. All that's currently left is the closing remarks, and then the instructions from the judge, and then the eventual conclusion from the jury. This is going to mostly be coming from the New York Times. We also have reports from ABC and NBC, and finally Red State that we're going to use for these summaries. Like and subscribe if you're looking for daily news content. This is your April 16th Not So News update. Let's dive on in. Starting us off from the New York Times, they do a summary of day 10. This was on April 3rd. Sorry, this would have been April 9th. Sorry. Here are the main highlights that they mentioned. The county medical examiner said drug use and heart disease were a secondary factor in Mr. Floyd's death. Police officers, not drug caused George Floyd's death. A pathologist testified Mr. Floyd's oxygen was cut off during his arrest. A breathing expert said one witness explained that talking does not mean able to breathe adequately. A police surgeon said Mr. Floyd did not act like someone overdosing on fentanyl. I think overall, what we're going to see as a trend for this week, I thought the prosecution did a good job in the latter weeks of the court case, specifically their use of the expert, like scientific witnesses that they use. Essentially, what we're seeing is the case being made by the prosecution is that scientifically speaking, the knee on the back of the neck was the only cause for was the only explanation for the death of George Floyd. Obviously, the defense is going to appeal that there's reasonable doubt that, and essentially what that means is going to appeal to other methods that could potentially have killed George Floyd in the in the events that led to this trial. Coming from day 11, this is also come from the New York Times. We're gonna kind of read our way up. First, they had Shonda Hill. She was one of the women in the video. She was in the car with George Floyd. She was also in the like corner store. I don't know what to exactly call it, the Cup Foods restaurant. And essentially, her testimony wasn't really anything too spectacular. She essentially just said that she really did just say that George Floyd was taking drugs, and really nothing more than that. They then start sorry, I should have mentioned that day 11 also started with some of the defense witnesses. So next one was this individual, Barry Broad, who is a former police officer and a use of force expert. Essentially, what he gave, in my opinion, what was one of the strongest defenses, and in my opinion, was not a good job by the prosecution. This is probably the one witness that I think is going to stick for the defense. Specifically, he mentioned that more use of force could have been justified. I believe he even mentioned that the hold being done by Derek Chauvin would be a common occurrence if he were a police officer. And that's about it for that. And other than that, they start going into some of the other events and day 13. Day 13 is going to be one of the interesting days, I think, when we look at this. Here's ABC News and their reports from day 12. They also go into the Barry Broad individual, and they had the following quote that I thought was interesting to the trial. I felt that Officer Chauvin's interaction with Mr. Floyd were following his training, following current practices in policing, Broad said, and were objectively reasonable. This sets up a reasonable defense, I think, for the defense, saying that if the actions taken by Derek Chauvin were reasonable actions, then he can't reasonably be held responsible for the murder of George Floyd. I think this does at least leave a little bit of question for the manslaughter charges. And I want to personally say I didn't think that this type of comments were really being questioned by the prosecution. Going into day 14, they have one in this comes from NBC News, sorry, and Janelle Griffith is the author of this, and she goes into essentially just her breakdown of day 13, and this is where we have kind of an interesting event for the next couple days in the trial. So this expert witness, David Fowler, he's the former chief medical examiner of Maryland. He takes the stand. He is essentially going to be the scientific evidence for the defense, and he essentially says that there's more possibilities for how George Floyd could have died. I think it's important to note that he isn't claiming one of these was undoubtedly the way that George Floyd died. All that the defense is really trying to say is that there's reasonable doubt that Derek Chauvin was the one completely responsible for the death. Some of the theories that he included were obviously the drugs, obviously the heart conditions that have been talked about throughout the trial. They also mention a potential tumor that was found during the autopsy. And finally, the interesting piece of evidence that kind of goes into the next day as well is he has a theory of carbon monoxide poisoning, and he bases this off of that George Floyd was being held on the ground in the pavement by the police officer's car. Going at some of the other and here's Ben Kesselin hits that point. Defense introduces evidences about open air carbon monoxide poisoning. And this was, I think it's really interesting that this was the piece of evidence that's really been latched on by the public. And I think people are misunderstanding the purpose of the carbon monoxide argument. Essentially, the question that's being asked is what killed George Floyd, and the prosecution needs to make an explicit argument that it was Derek Chauvin. The defense is trying to say it could be, they're able to take this shotgun approach of saying that it's any one of these other things. And obviously the carbon monoxide isn't the hardest point, but it's just the one that's kind of been the one that the defense, you'll see, actually ends up calling a new witness for. So next, New York Times reports on the David Fowler testimony. This is still day 14. David Fowler, former chief medical examiner of Maryland, said he believed that Mr. Floyd died from cardiac arrhythmia. The one thing that you'll notice throughout this hearing is that cardiac arrhythmia isn't actually anything particularly interesting. It just means essentially your heart was, out of rhythm. I think the following just was kind of interesting. During cross-examination, Dr. Fowler said that he had not seen emissions data from the car or seen the car in person, and that carbon monoxide poisoning was not mentioned in the autopsy. Dr. Fowler said he eliminated asphyxia as a cause of death, contradicting the argument made by prosecutors after citing numerous studies that found that the prone position is not usually dangerous. Dr. Fowler asserted that the positioning and weight of Mr. Chauvin's knee on Mr. Floyd's neck did not injure him. The prosecution later raised questions about the reliability of the study's findings. I think the last sentence there is the piece that's interesting in regards to this trial. The question is, we kind of just have two scientific experts that, were the ones that gave testimony. We're about to talk to one of the former ones from last week, as well as this one coming from the defense, Dr. Fowler. And essentially what we have are just two scientific experts that are disagreeing with each other. This is probably pretty common in most cases that, get this type of, scientific basis for whether a particular event is responsible. And I personally, I don't know what the jury is going to find off of this. I don't think any of them are obviously going to be experts in, these types of, field when it comes to breathing. That's such a specialty, and it's just very interesting to see what the jury will find. So finally, I want to report on something that comes out of Red State. Breaking prosecutorial error with state's witness creates grounds for possible mistrial in Chauvin trial. So essentially what happened is, based off of Fowler's testimony, which was the expert from the defense, Dr. Tobin, which was the breathing expert that was brought up by the prosecution, was recalled to the stand, essentially. I want to just go into the background reported by Red State. I think Red State does slightly misrepresent some of the events that are being reported here, and I doubt a mistrial is going to happen. But there were a couple interesting actions done by the state that I personally am not a big fan of. So going into it, even though the report has been let's start back. The standard panel of blood gas reading set at the request of the ER physicians would not normally have included this test result. The machines that test blood does not measure CO content is reflected in a master report that is produced by the machine. Essentially what's going on is that there was a test result found I guess it would be yesterday night, or this would be day 14 night, sorry, day delayed when recording this, it answered some of the questions that were brought up by Dr. Fowler. Obviously this becomes an issue because the prosecution is trying to bring up new evidence during trial, that the defense would have changed, part of their testimony, would have changed some of their questioning. They might have not even talked about the carbon monoxide as part of one of the theories. You have to remember that Floyd brought up, Fowler brought up about four, I think it was a total of 4 different theories on how George Floyd could have died. And they're trying to bring in a expert witness to attack one of those. And obviously being the last witness, I'm assuming this is going to be kind of the last hurrah for the jury. I don't know if that's kind of a normal thing, but that's at least the way that we see it coming off. So the bigger problem for the defense, that Dr. Fowler has already left Minneapolis and was on the plane returning to his home, meaning the defense would be unable to call Dr. Fowler back to the witness stand after Dr. Chauvin in order to have Dr. Fowler review the same testing reports and incorporate them into his previous testified opinion. The impressions that would leave the jury with would be that Dr. Fowler was not able to address the criticisms that Dr. Chauvin was likely to testify as a rebuttal witness using these test reports that had never been sent to the defense in the case. Had the reports been timely produced to the defense as required, Dr. Fowler would have had the test reports to review at the time he formed his opinions and prepared his testimony. I think what's kind of interesting to report also is the way that Dr. Fowler became an expert in this case. He kind of works with a organization that, and he mentions this as part of his testimony, that his organization is about 13, 14 doctors that end up being specialties in their own fields, and they kind of come to this universal conclusion on what happened, or they kind of more just are, it seems like skeptics of trying to find holes in the state's theory, at least in this case. Judge Cahill sustained the defense's objection to the prosecution's request to have Dr. Chauvin testify about the carbon monoxide test results, or to criticize Dr. Fowler's testimony based on information in those reports. Judge Cahill did allow the prosecution to call Dr. Chauvin to testify in response to other topics addressed by Dr. Fowler in his testimony on behalf of Chauvin. The one part that Red State does not clarify here that I think would have been better and probably made this story a little bit more balanced, not bias, lack of bias, would be that the judge also said that there was a test that was initially done called it was like an oxygen saturation, which essentially says how much what percentage of blood is has oxygen. The finding was 98%, which implies that the blood would not have more than 2% carbon monoxide, which was essentially the testimony that Dr. Chauvin does eventually give on the stand. So I think what's kind of interesting is if we go into what actually happened during the testimony. Judge Cahill warned the prosecution that even if Dr. Chauvin's testimony hints at existence of the testing result, the prosecution would be at serious risk of having a mistrial declared. When Dr. Chauvin took the stand, the prosecutor began a series of questions about Dr. Fowler's report, which Dr. Fowler had testified to and which had been admitted into evidence. The prosecutor asked about one part of the Fowler's report, which said it was possible that Floyd's carbon monoxide level in his blood could have been as high as 15 to 18%, meaning it was the presence of carbon monoxide in the blood and not the actions of Chauvin's and the officers that led to the low oxygen level that killed Floyd. Dr. Chauvin testified that he disagreed with that opinion. Prosecution asked why. Dr. Chauvin testified he disagreed because of the test results done at the hospital that measured the carbon monoxide rates in Floyd's blood. That was the new test that he's referring to, and not necessarily the oxygen saturation test that was announced as permissible. The defense objected and asked for a sidebar discussion with the judge, where I'm certain defense counsel Nelson asked for a mistrial. Content of the sidebar is unknown, but after it was, the judge sustained the objection and directed the prosecutor to rephrase the question. Essentially, what I'm assuming happened is that it was a formality of sustaining the objection, but requiring the prosecutor to rephrase the question such that Dr. Chauvin was going to reference that oxygen saturation test rather than the carbon monoxide level test. Prosecution asked again whether Dr. Chauvin agreed or disagreed with the opinion that Floyd's carbon monoxide level could have been as high as 18%. Chauvin again testified that based on the review blood testing done at the hospital, Floyd's oxygenation rate of his blood was 98%. It's a combination. So a little bit of misunderstanding here. They're assuming that the blood can only be oxygen and carbon monoxide. There is a possibility for other things, but if we know that the oxygenation rate is 98%, the carbon monoxide rate could not be more than 2%. However, this is not a direct violation of the limitations set by Judge Cahill. The red state asked how this is not a direct violation of the limitations set by Judge Cahill. I think I made a reasonable argument for why it could be. And personally, I think red state's being a little biased here. I don't think I think they're kind of just leaning on this a little bit too much. I do not expect a mistrial to happen as a result of this. So my predictions going into next week, the concluding arguments are expected for Monday, and then they start, jury discussions for what's going to happen. My predictions right now, I don't see either the murder charges being held, and I kind of see manslaughter as a coin flip. And I'm really 50-50. I don't know what kind of I've really been watching all the daily events kind of just in chunks. I just watch at 2x speed, and it ends up really only being about 2 hours of content per day. So I'm able to watch an entire week in a single day, and I personally, I'm leaning towards no manslaughter charge, but that also might just be my personal bias going into. And this is your April 16th. That's a news update. Once again, please like and subscribe if you're looking for daily news content, and have a good one.